Hey friend, thank you so much for checking out our YouTube channel. My name is Justin and I'm one of the pastors here at One Life Church. I pray that this sermon that you're about to watch will bless you and encourage you as you follow the person of Jesus. I want to turn your attention to the description below. There's some links in the description that will help you learn more about One Life Church and stay connected to this church family. One link that you'll find is for the Bible app. We use the Bible app here at One Life for sermon notes, announcements, scripture readings. So go ahead and click on that link and follow along as you watch today's teaching. All right, friend, thanks so much for hanging out. Let's jump into the sermon.
Hey, my name is Carrie, and I am so happy to be with you guys this morning on the first day of football season because I totally knew that it was. No, I was like, why is everybody wearing jerseys today? This is fun. And that is not a reflection on my husband, who I'm sure did know, but football equals crafting time for me. So like, yay, craft season. But it is also the second to last week of our Kingdom Truth series. And Justin will be here to finish up next week. And this week's truth, what God does through us, he first does in us. And for me, this is probably the hardest one for me to remember, let alone say. I've been saying it wrong all week. But I've really been thinking about this truth for a couple weeks and how I can convey this idea in a way that it's not harmful, but it acknowledges the stories that everyone here has lived. And when I thought about how this could be done in a harmful way, my mind flashed back to church camp. Like Justin, I was a camp kid too. I loved camp. And I went every summer from the ages of 10 to 23. I was a camper first and then a counselor. And it was at church camp where I heard the call to ministry. And it was at camp where I came forward and knelt down and dedicated my life to vocational ministry. Camp is so important to me. But I can absolutely commiserate about some of the wacky things that camp taught me and about some of the things that I have had to undo as an adult. Now, if you were a camp kid or if you were involved in youth group, you might have experienced what I like to call traumatic testimony time. You know what I'm talking about? That's when one of the counselors or older campers or youth leaders would get up and give their testimony. And the ones I heard would have a lot. I learned things about sex and drugs that I probably did not need to know as a 14-year-old from testimony time. I remember one guy who got up and shared the horrific child abuse he endured with details that still upset me if I think about them. And these testimonies, they would be like 95% horror story and about 5%, and then Jesus saved me, and look at me now, I'm here at camp. Anybody remember those? Yeah. And these stories conveyed two very important things to me. One, God only uses people who have suffered immensely and have lived to tell the tale. And two, that meant God wouldn't use a church girl who didn't date, and her idea of a party was drinking sparkling grape juice with her best friends in a fancy dress. True story. We did that. And I remember praying, God, just give me something interesting that I could use as a testimony, because that's the only way I am ever going to get to minister to people. Now, that is not the kind of thing we were talking about today. And don't think I'm saying that God can't use people with stories like that to comfort and encourage others. But I think where most of us fall is somewhere in the middle, where we can see that God has definitely done something in us, but we're not really sure how that's going to translate to through us. And that is what we're going to work through today. How we can have eyes to see our story and know how to use it in a way that aligns with the work that God is doing in the people around us. So we're going to talk about someone in the New Testament whose story we know pretty well because it's documented in Acts, and then he shares it himself 2 additional times and sprinkled throughout the rest of the New Testament. I'm talking about Saul, who later becomes Paul. And yeah, I agree. He totally had a dramatic testimony. Yes, he was a killer of Christians. He was blinded on the road to Damascus, spoken to by Jesus, and then he became one of the well-known figures of the Bible. Yes. But there is so much more to his story than just that part. God was working in Saul long before he became Paul. Saul was born in a city in modern-day Turkey called Tarsus. Tarsus was a prosperous city that was favored by the Romans. It was actually the spot where Mark Antony and Cleopatra rendezvoused for the first time. And apparently, Mark Antony loved the city so much, he made it tax-free forever. That was probably a pretty good date. The city was like, no taxes ever. And it was also well known for being one of the intellectual centers of the Roman world that rivaled Athens, it rivaled Alexandria. Philosophers would sit along the riverside and debate the issues of the day, and anybody in the town could come and sit and listen to them. Paul was a kid at the feet of philosophers. And Saul was also born to a family that was favored by the Romans. And it was despite their Jewish ethnicity and their Jewish religion. And therefore, Saul, he was a Roman citizen by birth, which was the highest form of citizenship there was. And when Saul was a bit older, his family moved to Jerusalem, where he was educated by one of the most well-respected rabbis of his day, Gamaliel. He learned Hebrew, he learned Aramaic, he memorized the entire Old Testament, which to him was just Testament. And he knew it. Yeah. And he became a prominent religious leader among the Pharisees. He had it pretty good growing up. And all these factors enabled Paul, after his conversion, to preach about Jesus to pretty much anybody. He could speak to the Greek philosopher in Athens using their concepts from their philosophy and their religion, because he knew it. He could speak in the synagogues with the authority that came from being a Pharisee and a teacher of the law. And as a Roman citizen, he was able to testify before Nero himself. In Paul's own words, he says, to the Jews, I became like a Jew to win the Jews. To those under the law, I became like one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, so as to win those under the law. To those not having the law, I became like one not having the law, though I'm not free from God's law, but I'm under Christ's law, so as to win those not having the law. To the weak, I became weak to win the weak. I have become all things to all people, so that by all possible means I might save some. And Paul could say this with confidence because it was true. His upbringing made him uniquely qualified to be all things to all people in a way that made God's ministry through him so effective. And God prepares us much in the same way he did the Apostle Paul. Now, I don't mean that y'all hung out with philosophers in grade school or anything, but I want you to think about what you are passionate about. The things, the people, the causes that really mean a lot to you. Maybe the way you, or the job you work at, you consider a calling. I am meant to do this thing. Why are you drawn to those things? In what way has God prepared you, maybe years in advance, for the place where you are now? And it doesn't have to be anything bad. We can look at both positive and negative experiences that have prepared us for the compassion and the passions we have now. I can tell you that as a little girl, I never in a million years thought I would be standing right here today preaching in a church. That door was firmly closed to me. In fact, in backstage, and it happened in main stage? I don't know what this is called. Main service. When I saw Wake and Cadence holding the communion trays and Maddie helping them, like, hey, make sure you hold it up and stand with your hands on it and everything. I was walking back there and, I fell apart. Because when I was a little girl, that was impossible. And I remember that I would stand there with the guys in my youth group before service, and we were talking, and my dad was the one that was responsible for gathering up the communion servers, and his name is Doug, and he's still here. And the guys would see him coming, and they're like, "Oh, Doug's coming, gotta scatter," and then they would run because they didn't want him to choose them. And I was like, I'd like to do it, but I was never allowed to, and I am so thankful that we got to have that moment today. It was so, so beautiful. But preparing me, I think about my dad also. And when I grew up, we went to a non-instrumental Church of Christ. And when I was in high school, we switched to an instrumental Church of Christ. That's literally the only difference. But I remember my dad studying for 2 years before he was comfortable making that change. And I was like, Dad, it is literally just a piano. We're going from no piano to piano. That is literally it. And my dad said, Carrie, you can't just change a belief because you want to. You can't just change your belief because you feel like it, because that church is bigger. That church has a better youth group. I'm not going to change my belief until I have studied it and I have discerned it to the point where I can make that change because I believe it. And I know it's the right thing to do. And that experience prepared me for the intense years of studying and discerning I did when I felt the call to ministry so strongly, but every voice I'd ever heard said, you can't. What I witnessed in my dad helped me to change my belief, not because it was something I wanted to do. I wasn't like, I'm going to get up here and talk. No. Because it was something I truly believe is in line with what God is doing in the world and in the church. And the things that God has been doing in you your whole life, they have prepared you for where you are today. And this is part of your story. And if you haven't ever really thought about it, here's what I want you to do. I want you this week sometime, make a list of all the things you really care about. And then beside it, I want you to write your why. Why do I care about those things? And I think what you're going to see is this picture coming together of how God has been prepping you for the way you are uniquely created to care for those things. And nobody's list is going to be the same, and that is awesome. Little Saul, he never would have dreamed that all his classes, his hometown, his very citizenship were preparing him for the day that he would dedicate his life telling people about a Messiah that he wouldn't even meet until after he had tried to kill his followers. But God did. And that leads us to the next part of Paul's life. So Saul grew up to be a faithful Pharisee, and he was of the belief that the followers of Jesus of Nazareth were blasphemers who were corrupting Judaism with their insistence that a false Messiah had died and risen again. And when Stephen, the very first person killed for this belief, was being stoned to death, Saul was standing there holding the cloaks of the witnesses to the execution. And here's what happened next. It's in the book of Acts, chapter 8. The Bible tells us, on that day, a great persecution broke out against the church in Jerusalem, and all except the apostles were scattered throughout Judea and Samaria. Godly men buried Stephen and mourned deeply for him. But Saul began to destroy the church. Going from house to house, he dragged off both men and women and put them in prison. Saul was on the warpath against Jesus and his followers. He allowed his zeal for his faith to push him to imprison and cause the death of innocent men and women in all of Jerusalem. But he didn't stop with Jerusalem. He had his sights set on more. And the story continues in chapter 9. Meanwhile, Saul was still breathing out murderous threats against the Lord's disciples. He went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues in Damascus, so that if he found any there who belonged to the way, which was what Christianity was called before it was Christianity, whether men or women, he might take them as prisoners in Jerusalem. Y'all, Damascus is 135 miles away from Jerusalem. Saul was committed to this. But something happens on the road to Damascus. And this is something that I really wish I would have had time to talk about last week when we talked about how God knows when to say enough, and so can we. So I'm really glad I'm doing 2 back to back. I mentioned that there were several different definitions of enough, and I was only able to share one last week. Well, here is another one. Sometimes enough means stepping in and saying, enough. This isn't going to happen anymore. On the road to Damascus, God stepped in and said, enough to Saul. As he neared Damascus on his journey, suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him. He fell to the ground and heard a voice say to him, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? Who are you, Lord? Saul asked. I'm Jesus, whom you are persecuting. Now get up and go into the city, and you will be told what you must do. The men traveling with Saul stood there speechless. They heard the sound but did not see anyone. Saul got up from the ground, but when he opened his eyes, he could see nothing. So they led him by the hand into Damascus. For 3 days he was blind and did not eat or drink anything. And after 3 days, God sent a man named Ananias to his house where Saul was staying. And Ananias told Saul, Brother Saul, the Lord Jesus, who appeared to you on the road as you were coming here, has sent me so that you may see again and be filled with the Holy Spirit. Immediately, something like scales fell from Saul's eyes, and he could see again. He got up and he was baptized. And after taking some food, he regained his strength. And after that, Saul went on to the synagogue that he planned to deliver the arrest warrant to and started to preach that he was wrong, Jesus was the Son of God. Yeah. And the people who heard it, they were totally shocked. And they asked each other, like, wait, isn't this the guy who was persecuting the followers of Jesus? And he's supposed to be here arresting them, not joining them. People had issues with this in Damascus. They really did. And then when he got back to Jerusalem, and he was like, hey guys, I'm one of you now. The disciples were kind of like, for real? Yeah, it's a pretty cool story. You should read it. Saul was completely transformed by Jesus. He went from Pharisee to apostle, from murderer to brother. And his message was so powerful because those around him knew who he used to be and who he was now. What God did to Saul's heart flowed out through his lips and changed countless hearts around him. God transforms us too. Every single time we say yes to Jesus and no to the things of the adversary. This transformation, it absolutely does come at your conversion. But it also comes when you have been through fire and you have survived and you have come out the other side. And everything you have learned and how you've grown can be an authentic and powerful message to those who need to hear your story. But hear me in this. Scars are beautiful, but gaping wounds are not. And this is what I mean. A scar tells a story of a wound that's been healed. Scars make you ask, wow, they survived some serious pain. I need to know more about that. But if I stood up here with my arm chopped off and like bleeding everywhere on the floor, you wouldn't go like, oh, wow, that's beautiful. You'd go, we need to call an ambulance because that girl needs some help. We all have experiences that are scars. And these are things that we've been through and we've healed from through the help of Christ and our support systems. And we can remember the pain without feeling the pain. And when we think back on it, we don't see ourselves in the trenches, but we see how God had been there pulling us out the whole time. And that's the story we need to tell. And I want to share with you a little bit about my story. And if you've been around One Life long enough, you probably already know this about me. But if you're newer, I went through a divorce when I was in my early 20s. And it was a ministry divorce, and it was really messy and awful. And when my first marriage ended, I felt so adrift and alone. And I remember this image that was stuck in my mind that, like a nuclear bomb, had dropped on my life. Everything was ash. And I was standing there in the middle of the wreckage, the lone survivor, going, what now? But then I see how God brought people out of the woodwork to help me not only survive, but thrive. The life group members that I had barely gotten to know, who showed up at a moment's notice to move washers and dryers and boxes that I could not lift. The people back home who hadn't seen me in years, who were sending me gift cards and house supplies to help me build back what I had. The random church that showed up to my apartment with a box of food that I almost refused. But it covered a need that I was too ashamed to admit. Friends like Kayla, who was standing up here singing this morning, and some of my other girlfriends who basically kidnapped me for that entire summer and made sure I was never alone. And I had some experiences that summer that were some of the best of my life. I can look back on that time and I feel peace. And I almost feel this sense of joy that God took me from such a horrible place to a life that I feel blessed to live every day. And when I was coming out of that time, I came upon 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 3 through 4. And that verse I just grasped onto and hung onto. And it says, "Praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of compassion and the God of all comfort, who comforts us in our troubles so that we can comfort those in any trouble with the comfort we ourselves receive from God." Our scars, they show the story of healing, and they enable us to speak to people who are still standing among the wreckage and bleeding. And our stories suddenly aren't about our pain, but about using the things that God did through our pain to bring us to a place where we can comfort the one hurting. We can have courage to say yes when God is moving our hearts to share our scars. And I love that we did the song today that the line is like one of my favorite lines. "Oh, let him in, or let him out. With every yes, the kingdom's coming." Every yes is God working through us to bring the kingdom of heaven to earth. Your scars are beautiful. We all carry scars. But we've got some wounds too. And these are the things that we've gone through or are still going through that we still feel pain from. They haven't scarred over yet. Or maybe they're starting to, but like if we touch it or pick at it long enough, we're going to start bleeding again. And these things aren't part of our story yet. If we shared those things, it probably wouldn't be helpful to us or anybody else. And that's okay. Remember this truth: what God does through us, he first does in us. There are areas where God is still working in us, and it's not time yet for him to work through us. And I carry some wounds too, absolutely. And there are things that it would not be helpful for me to talk about right now. And God is still working in me through prayer and reading and family and a really good counselor. And one day I have faith that these things will become part of my story and part of the ministry that God has given me. But right now, I'm okay with the in part, because the through part, it'll come. And Paul was the same way. He tells his conversion story twice in the book of Acts. And the scars he carried from that story were an incredibly powerful testimony to what Jesus can do. But Paul also had some wounds. He writes to the church at Corinth, whom he had a really close relationship with this church. And he talks about this thing called the thorn in his flesh. And this was something painful. This was something that caused him to suffer. And he says that he had prayed 3 times for God to remove it, and God hadn't. And he's able to communicate this part of this story to his close friends, but we don't ever see him preaching about it in the New Testament. God working in us and through us, it's not a one-time thing. You're not going to wake up one morning and be like, okay, in part is done for the rest of my life. I am perfect now. Let's get going on the through. No. We are always going to have areas where God is still bringing healing and wisdom in our hearts. And we will have areas where that transformation has occurred, and it's time for God to work through us to help others. It's a process of walking with God and maturing and growing as we work through our unpredictable and finite lives.